Okay, here we go. Hey, everybody. Welcome back to Autism Confidential, the podcast from the National Council on Severe Autism. I'm Jill Escher. I'm the president of NCSA, and I'm your host today. And I'm extra super duper excited about today's guest. As I told you in the last two podcasts, we have a little three-part series. Amy and I had attended the Together for Choice conference in Las Vegas, Nevada, a few weeks ago. They had really wonderful speakers who were talking about issues mostly relating to adult housing and adult programming, for obviously adults with IDD and autism. And so we're featuring three of those speakers in this mini series. You heard from Molly Knock-On, you heard from Mary Ogle, just amazing women. And today, for our final, we have Richard Edley. And Richard is the CEO and president of Rehabilitation and Community Providers Association in Pennsylvania. And he knocked it out of the park at this conference. Unfortunately, it wasn't recorded, but rarely do we see somebody in this space speaking so rationally and so clear-headedly about the problems we are facing in our IDD adult system today. So welcome, Richard.
Thank you for having me, Jill. Appreciate it.
So excited to have you. Now, I just want to start off with this one line that you shared at the end of your presentation. You said, if we had designed a system for collapse, this is how we would design it. And that resonated with me. It stuck with me. I'm like, that's right. If you were designing a system to fail our adults with severe IDD, this is how you would do it. I want to kind of frame, our questions moving forward around that. But start off telling us about the IDD system in Pennsylvania, if you will. Tell us a little bit about the size of the system, the number of people served. Tell us a little bit about the growth of autism in your system. Tell us a bit about the wait lists and the nature of the state centers and HCBS offerings. That was a big question. I'm sorry.
Okay. No, sure. Pennsylvania has a pretty robust system. I'll start with the positive, and then I'll get into some of my concerns. Roughly $4 to $5 billion being spent, along with federal match, on 57,000 people being served. And this is residential, vocational employment, home and community-based services, and so forth. And so certainly there are a lot of people getting quality services. I think there's a few different problems, though. The first, in no particular order, but you mentioned the wait list. We do have a wait list of 12,000 people, of which 5,000 are on the emergency wait list. And I realize there are some states that have cleared wait lists and some states that have even more. But in terms of Pennsylvania, that's a big issue, that that there are people who today need emergency services and are getting none. Sometimes you'll hear from officials, well, they're receiving some services, just not what they need. But what that typically means is the person may need 24/7 care, and they're getting supports coordination, a case manager. And I've said that's sort of like if you need a heart surgeon and you need heart surgery, and they go, I'm sorry, we just don't have any surgeons, but we have a social worker who could speak with your family every week. I mean, that's sort of the equivalent. To compound it, so that's the 5,000. What's less talked about is since the beginning of COVID, because of the workforce crisis, about 4,000 people have lost services. And these are also people who need services today. And then there's roughly estimated about 1,000 people who've been approved for waivers, but again, because of the workforce crisis, can't find any. So it's really more like 10,000 people today that really need services desperately and can't find it in Pennsylvania.
And one thing you did touch on quite a bit was that there seemed to be a differential impact on those who have the more severe disabilities, because as you mentioned, some of the services were closing, and we have a workforce crisis. They're constrained in terms of who they can accept as clients. Can you tell us a little bit more about that?
Yeah, as programs close, and programs are closing, some of our data said that 34% of the providers in our system, and these are hundreds of providers, have permanently closed programs. 62% said they're serving less people, and another 27% said, well, they haven't closed yet, but they will be closing programs. And if you think about it logically, that if you have someone who needs a couple of hours of staffing in the community a day or a week or whatever, well, you could probably find a staff person to do that. What if you have someone who needs, again, 24/7 care, and to be in the community might even need two staff with them?
Yep.
Well, on a staffing crisis, you say, I can't staff that. So when we talk about the thousands of people who've lost services, it is differentially impacting those with the most serious issues, behavioral and medical complications, and as severe autism, severe and complex intellectual and developmental disabilities, and so forth. And that really does worry me. And when we did one of our surveys of providers, one of the providers actually, we allow them to comment, of course, anything we missed. And they said, you asked the wrong question. I've actually increased the number of people I serve. I just can't serve anyone with any acuity. And that's a problem system.
Yeah, we see that across the country. And I think it was exacerbated by COVID and the various closures, that came with COVID. So let's delve into a couple of questions. First of all, I'm wondering, this is a favorite topic of mine. What has the impact of the growth in autism cases been like in Pennsylvania? Do you have data on that in particular? Is it something that you see? Because when I talk to service providers who've been in business, sometimes for decades, what I hear from them all the time is, it was very rare, right, to have an adult with autism. Most of their cases were more classic IDD presentations. And now they have more and more and more complex autism cases, really unprecedented to them, and they have a difficult time adjusting. I'm just wondering, like, do you see this in Pennsylvania? I'm in California, other side of the country. What have you seen about autism in particular in the past decade or so?
Yeah, I don't have the exact numbers, but there's no question you're right. The same providers I talk to are saying that it's a different population today than a decade ago, 20 years ago, and so forth. And it really is the severity, and the severity comes from the mix of the autism with IDD. And in Pennsylvania, also, the way the system works makes it even a little trickier. When you're under age 21, and if you have a primary autism diagnosis, you get all of your service through basically the behavioral health system, which here is called Health Choices. So if the in-school help, after-school help, in-home things, all get paid by the behavioral health system. Well, when you hit age 21, it's the classic, and I'm sure you've heard this also, that's where the families fall off the cliff, and you come to the realization, wow, so I'm no longer getting the school system. I'm no longer getting behavioral health other than maybe a psychiatry appointment. I got nothing. So at about, sometimes it's very early on, but certainly as the child progresses through the teen years, parents in Pennsylvania realize my child, even though it's autism, clearly could, if I wanted to, could get them evaluated and would qualify for intellectual and developmental disabilities. That does have funding for age 21 and above through the Office of Developmental Programs. So when we talk about the wait list, that's the wait list we know about. Every year, thousands of people are moved from the behavioral health system to the IDD system and immediately go on the wait list. And that's what we've said when governors in Pennsylvania say, great news, we have an initiative. This year, we're going to take 100 people off the wait list. Well, first of all, going back to what I said earlier, they're not going to find services. But even if they could, so you took 100 off, as another 1,000 just got on. So the numbers are staggering and getting bigger.
Yeah, you should see. I mean, in California, we keep exceptionally good data, and it's exponential. The people with autism in DDS, in Department of Developmental Services system, and it's birth cohort data. So you see every birth cohort more and more and more cases, and it's not subtle. It's an 11% year-over-year increase. Okay, so I wanted to talk about the fact that you guys do have some state centers that have been under threat of closure. I don't know what the status of them are now. And I know that you don't focus on the state centers, right? You're focusing on the community providers. But maybe you can tell us a little bit about the landscape and the politics around that right now.
Yeah, there are several state centers that continue to exist in Pennsylvania, and there is an initiative to close them down. So they're in the process of finalizing the closure of 2 additional ones. And you're right, that's not our issue per se, but in terms of supporting the population and families, whenever I'm asked about it, I'll say, okay, theoretically speaking, you can close the state centers. I'm not going to object, but you better have good quality services to support those people who are coming out and to allow the families to have some choice in the matter and have some say in the matter. I also encourage people, have you ever visited a state center? I think there's this belief that, all right, we'll close them down, they'll get some apartments, but these are people with some pretty serious needs. And I have gone on a tour of state center to see for myself what's going on. And I see that, I understand why an advocate would say this isn't the right setting, but I also see that in today's world, they're not the evil enemy either. They're really doing their best they can with a very difficult population. And that's sort of what I say about all these kinds of programs. When advocates say, not to shift, but like, we need to close down every sheltered workshop, every facility-based setting. We need to end 14C. I mean, if I want to be sort of take devil's advocate, okay, great. Now, where are those people going? What's happening? Right. And that's the trick. And a lot of advocates I see out there don't answer that second part of the question. They're focused.
They never do.
Just close it down.
Mm-hmm.
And you know this from my recent presentation, but just to get it out there, obviously I live. My job is to support providers who are providing services to those most in need, sort of the safety net providers in Pennsylvania. It's across 9 divisions of health and human services. That autism and IDD is a particularly big one, and one under a spotlight today. I'm also a clinical psychologist by background, but as you heard me say, I'm also the parent of a 31-year-old who fits this category of severe autism and IDD. And so a lot of these policies and a lot of these ideas that advocates come out with in the administration and national groups, yes, I understand it professionally and I intellectually and so forth, but I also live it every day. And I'll listen to some of these policies and say, right, I hear you. You understand how that will hurt my son and thousands of others. And I think that's part of the equation that's often missed.
I think you used a term, something like people based in the real world and people who are based in theology. Yeah. That's perfect. It's exactly right. There's the theologians out there who are like, oh, everybody should get a competitive, integrated job and everybody should live in the community. And then there's the people who have reality brains who are like, I wish.
I got on a roll that day.
Yeah.
But it is true that I've said that a lot of my job, I go to state meetings where there's a lot of stakeholders and advocates and so forth talking about these issues. And I often feel like the discussion is gravitating to what I would call the highest 5% of functioning individuals in these categories. So the discussion is about independent living. It is about competitive integrated employment, about helping people get into college courses and things like that. And I always say that is wonderful. This is a great discussion and we need to support these people. But why aren't we talking about those who have a lot of needs as well?
The 95%, right?
Yes.
Yeah. There's really outsized representation of those who are very privileged in terms of their cognitive functioning. And I think you mentioned how the cards are really stacked in Pennsylvania, and that it's hard even to get a seat at the table at some of these, task forces and agencies.
Absolutely, because it's talking about, people with significant needs and maybe who can't be in competitive employment, who maybe need more support than independent living. It's really politically incorrect now. We're not supposed to be talking about it or something like that. I think in my presentation, I began with all the words you're not allowed to say. Like, oh no. Oh. I mentioned that at one point I said, why can't we have a continuum of services? And someone had texted me, you really can't say that. I can't say a continuum of services.
Continuum of services. Yeah. Can something be more innocuous than that?
Right.
Oh, yeah.
They said that's code for keeping these programs open. I was like, I didn't realize that. I didn't know there was like a rule book about this. But so there's a lot of those things people don't even want to talk about. And this is where I get to, and every talk I give about this, or every conversation where I get to quote Amy Lutz, because you mentioned Amy, because I that was the thing where I naively said to her, why aren't we talking about this population? And that's where she said, because it's not fun. And she said, self-injurious behavior, aggression, property damage, 24/7. This is not what people want to talk about. They want to talk about, oh, look who is on a TV show. Look who's taking college courses. Now that's a fun story and it's uplifting. True, but we can't leave that population behind.
Yeah, no, I mean, this is just reality. And yeah, we speak out very vehemently against all of the language policing that's going on in autism and IDD these days. It's just, the euphemism police are everywhere. And it's not that we are disrespecting our children. It's not that we are, blaming them or anything, denigrating them in any sense, but we feel like it's our duty to tell their realities because that is an act of love and of care. It's not out of spite, right? So I don't really understand their logic, that we have to see everything through rose-colored glasses all the time. Okay, so oh, sorry.
Well, no, I was going to say that I've been doing this for exactly 10 years now. We just had our 10th anniversary at RCPA. For many years before that, I was really working in the behavioral health system, and so really had no exposure to a lot of what we're talking about, except as it impacted my son. But again, he would be back then in the behavioral health system, having autism. And when I took this job, I remember thinking, wait a minute, so I'm supposed to hate farms? Why is that? What's so bad about that? Like, that seems like a nice setting for, like, and I started to realize, but there's something going on here that seems really strange. Or even my son had gotten a job at what I didn't know they were even called workshops, but I thought, well, that's good. I mean, he seems to like it. I'm supposed to hate that too. I didn't realize this. And so it was an interesting transformation for me to realize that there's all sorts of things out there that people are fighting against that I'm trying to figure out why. I mean, couldn't that be part of a choice?
It's theology. I think you said it. It's a movement based in theory and ideology, and not in people, and not, as you said, not in data and facts. You
Mm-hmm.
know, and I think we can all kind of conjecture about why this has so gripped the disability rights movement, because you would think the disability rights movement would be about the realities of the people with disabilities, but
Mm-hmm.
instead it's about projecting some ideal. And does it have to do with money? Probably. Does it have to do with kind of broader political movements relating to diversity? Probably. I mean, I don't pretend to have the answer, but it is very hard to be a reality based advocate in a sea of people who are, by the way, paid usually by federal funds, right, to represent people with disabilities who run contrary to the actual needs of your child. I mean, you are definitely, David V., the federally funded Goliath of we all are of disability rights. It's very hard, and you're sitting there scratching your head saying, like, do they care about our kids? I think that they in some sense hold our kids in contempt because they don't like, it's not a good look.
Yeah, and if you think about it, like I said, I came from more of a behavioral health background. I look back, and we still have a very large at RCPA mental health division, adult and children, and so forth. You don't see that fight. I mean, there's room for people who are high functioning with anxiety. There's room for people who have schizophrenia and bipolar. It's not a fight. Why are we funding this? Whatever. Everyone should be, getting services. So it's a very strange battle.
It
That's
is strange. The identitarian movement, I think, has as part of it, right? This is an identity and not a disorder. That's a big narrative these days. I want to talk about HCBS because you shared something that, of course, I've heard from Amy and other people in Pennsylvania before about how Pennsylvania seems to have the most restrictive interpretation of the federal home and community based services waiver. And this is and for people who don't know, I know it's like we always talk all these acronyms, and some people are like, what are you talking about, Jill? So most Medicaid dollars to serve people like our population comes in the form of home and community-based services, HCBS waivers. And there is something called the Settings Rule. There are a variety of regulations, but for example, something called the Settings Rule, which states can interpret to restrict the options available. Richard, I want you to tell people about what's happening with HCBS in Pennsylvania.
Yeah, it is very, very restrictive. The person that Ashley Kim Weiss at Together for Choice said that she believes that Pennsylvania is the most restrictive in the country. I'm sure there'll be some argument there, but that gives you some sense. And on the settings rule side, they've really made it very clear that you can't have farmsteads, as I mentioned before, intentional communities, campuses, and so forth, that everyone needs to be in sort of community-based settings or shared living and so forth, like that. And so we were concerned enough because we said there are other states that do allow that and are serving people very well. And that's what the families really wanted for their adult child. So Representative Fitzpatrick from Pennsylvania, U.S. representative, wrote a letter on our behalf to CMS, basically saying, is this
CMS
true?
is the Centers for Medicare and Medicaid. Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah. There are times I give talks where I hand out a list of acronyms to
Yeah,
say,
I know it's bad.
And CMS wrote back very clearly, we have no prohibition on that. Basically CMS sets some broad guidelines and then goes to the states and says, you propose how you're going to meet these guidelines. Pennsylvania proposed, we're just not going to have any of these. Well, okay, but that's not really the requirement. That's a proposal. And so, but again, it goes back to this belief system. So I do know of some settings in Pennsylvania even that are more like these, but they're typically self-pay. I mean, and that's wonderful that some parents have figured a way to do it, but that's, again, not a solution for thousands and thousands of people who need the services.
Of course not.
Yeah, it's not viable. And so that's on that side of it. The other thing that's really being pushed is something called community participation in Pennsylvania. Again, when you step back, it sounds great. We're going to do everything possible to support people getting out into the community, and that's a great thing. Of course, when you start putting some rules around it, it gets very strange again. And some of this, the state will say, well, we never really implemented that. And that's because right when it was being implemented, COVID hit. So it's hard to say, but it's always interesting to look back what was proposed. And things were proposed like you could only go out in the community in groups of 3 at a time. And so you have to be out a certain percentage of time, like 20% of the time, to get the best fee, the best rate to support your services. So if you had a traditional sort of facility-based setting, and let's say the person really loved working there and had worked there for years, you literally have to say to them, all right, come on, we got to walk around the park now. We got to go take a drive to a library. And the person goes, I don't want to. Well, now the provider's in financial straits. And the notion that you could say to a provider, well, you can do whatever you want with the person, right, but not be reimbursed for it. That's really not viable either. So you have this thing with groups of 3 people. Well, what if 4 people want to get together? What if 6? And you can do it. Just don't expect to be reimbursed the same way. And then you get into all the things I just mentioned. What if you have medical and behavioral complications? We represent some providers who are really working with a very difficult medically compromised situation. They're saying every day we have to try to get them out with like a specialized van and nurses, and it's not so easy. And as one advocate said to me, that you have the right every day to go to Starbucks. And I said, I do have that right, but it's not mandated. I don't have to go out every day. And that here that's what's happening here. So between community participation and the push for that, and the push to close programs, and to say that you can't have any of these kinds of alternative living arrangements, like farmsteads and intentional communities, it really sets up a very difficult state for those most in need. And that's my biggest concern.
Yeah, one thing that always boggles my mind is the really bizarre hypocrisy around the application of the HCBS rules. Most notably, it's supposed to be about a person-centered plan, right? Well, that makes sense to me. I mean, you can't have a person-centered plan saying, oh, the person's going to fly to Hawaii every week, right? If that's what the person wants to do, it has to be a kind of a financially and operationally reasonable person-centered plan. But that's what should be driving the funding, and not these arbitrary rules. But it seems like we've totally forgot about the person-centered part and just went straight to theology. Well, I go to Starbucks, therefore he has to go to Starbucks. I go to the YMCA, he has to go to the YMCA. I mean, it's so strange to me.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and advocates will say you still have person-centered plans. That's true. Every single person has a plan. But you're correct. It's a plan within this construct and within these constraints. Or you risk just not getting reimbursed for these services.
Yeah, and it's, as I said, a system designed to fail the people who need specialized services. I wanted to talk about your ideas for kind of fixing the system, but I want to talk about a couple. First, I want to talk about some of these other obstacles you mentioned. Some of these I think are Pennsylvania specific, but I was really intrigued by them. You mentioned the need that the system uses a supports intensity scale.
Mm-hmm.
You told me, sorry, I was like, my jaw was on the floor when you were talking about this. It was like Kafka-esque level absurdity. Can you talk about that a little bit?
It's one of my favorite issues to discuss. And again, as a parent, I've lived through it twice personally. Basically, a decision was made that to get the CMS waiver, we're going to make sure every person in the system gets the same standardized measure. And the SIS is one that's out there, and it's been used by a number of states. The problem with the SIS is if you sit through it, and by the way, it can take 3.5 or more hours, thousands of questions and over and over and over. And even for someone like me who understands the importance, after a couple hours, you're like, I don't know, give them a 5, on the scale. You just start
yeah, we've all been that. Yeah.
I've had enough. But basically, it's a lot of questions that are really more focused on physical issues. So the classic examples: can your son cross the street, a busy street? Like, can he physically? Yeah, I wouldn't allow him to do it alone. I mean, he better have some staff person, but physically he can. So now he just scored high.
Wow.
Can he hold a knife? Yeah, I mean, he's able to hold a knife, but again, what situation we talk about? He'll need a staff person, but he can hold, and there's dozens of questions like that. Then it gets to the real bizarre where they want you to envision different things, and I understand now why maybe I'm too hardened about it, but they talk about families and parents. It's the re-traumatization of parents, because one of the questions is, if your son could go to college, what would they major in? I was saying, you're asking an interesting question about someone with severe autism who's largely nonverbal, who's in a community home for a reason. And then they make every question, you have to sort of say, how much support do they need? Every day, 3 days a week, 5 days a week, 4 hours a day, 6 hours a day. So you make up something and say, I don't know, I guess he'll be a history major. Just make it up. And they go, okay, would he need support 1 day a week in those classes, 3 days? At this point, I'm not even sure what we're answering. What are we doing? And,
oh my gosh.
And there's so many examples like that. And then Pennsylvania is one of the many states that also has back end tied it to the funding for the individual. Well, a number of our providers are complaining, we're working with someone with severe issues, and they just came back with a higher or lower, depending on how you're looking at it, SIS score. Our funding is going to get decreased.
Wow.
But we have the same services, and you mentioned the patient-centered plan. The plan still says that this is what the person needs, but the funding just dropped. So it's a big issue that we even just wrote as a group of organizations to the Secretary of Office of Developmental Programs this week to say, what are we doing here? This is a problem. So, when we began, you said designing a system to collapse. You start looking at all these things, and it's really intense. I mean, you really start to add it all up. And there are providers out there that are losing significant money, are tapping into their lines of credit, can't staff programs. And I think there's a belief by some politicians and administration, sort of like, the providers will figure it out. They always do. They'll do some fundraising, they'll get grants, they'll shift from other programs. Those days are gone. This is it. I mean, so it is something of concern.
Well, as we heard in our last podcast last week with Mary Ogle from Oklahoma, from A New Leaf outside of Tulsa, she talked about, they just need to massively do private fundraising. They can't deliver the services on what the government gives them. There's no option. There's no way out of that. And so she does put a lot of emphasis on that. And I think that's going to be the increasing reality. But morally, it shouldn't be. like, we don't see this elsewhere in the Medicaid system to this extent, where you are so systematically underfunding vital services. I mean, in a massive way. There would be a revolt, in other systems, but
Right.
not when it comes to IDD.
And we were largely flat funded in last year's budget as well. So with all this need and all the things we're talking about in the workforce crisis, basically telling providers in the midst of inflation as well, just do it again on the same amount of money while we have billions of dollars in reserves in what they call a rainy day fund for future initiatives.
Well, it doesn't get politicians any votes, to be funding this stuff. It's not politically attractive like some other areas, even though it's an absolute fundamental lifeline and necessity. Okay, so I wanted to talk about what should we be doing? I mean, we know there's a mania for closure. There's a mania for closing things and restricting options. But as we've seen with our cherished disability advocates, there's no mania for figuring out realistic solutions.
Right.
You are the rare bird that is like, okay, let's figure out realistic solutions. What do you see in your crystal ball? What are the things that can be changed in Pennsylvania and beyond to create the options, to reduce the wait lists, to provide realistic services?
Well, and before we even get to that, I just wanted to mention something as an aside that when we talked about like all the factors in Pennsylvania that could really backfire and bring the system down, a new proposal is out there called selective contracting. And it literally is based on getting a CMS waiver to restrict choice. So it's not even theoretically, if these things happen, choice may be restricted. Now, this is an initiative to restrict choice. And it's being done, said, to really focus more on an ability for the state to limit the provider network and focus on quality. And we have to be careful, because if we say this is wrong, it could backfire to us. And they say, well, you just want the status quo and you don't want to look at quality. So I'm not even saying we're against selective contracting, but we really need to understand it first, and what will be the impact, and what will be the impact on things like the wait list. And it also,
and I assume it would affect small providers more than the larger providers.
Absolutely. When we put in our official comments, that was our statement, because and in other states where this has happened in different ways, it immediately led to mergers, acquisitions, and closures and things like that, because the smaller providers didn't have the infrastructure to do this type of contracting and reporting. And some of the smaller providers are real specialty and high quality. So we have to make sure some of those things are addressed. But I just wanted to put that out there as well. Well, you've used the word rational. I really think that that's what has to happen. There has to be some kind of discussion where we get different people at the table. So it's not just the same cast of characters and the same stakeholders and the same advocates talking about, like you're saying, we got to close everything. What about a discussion about what makes sense, and what are families really asking for? And what about getting people like Amy Lutz at the table to talk about what other states are doing and things like that? And there is one task force at the state that was created by the legislature. So it's like a legislative IDD task force to look at everything, but it's a pretty slow process. And we were successful in getting literally Amy on there, I'm on there. We got 3 or 4 providers who are working with this population. So it could be a little bit different discussion than our usual. So I think more of that has to happen. But I think it's critical that we come out of that with some concrete solutions. This is government, and I'm part of a lot of committees, and we all look back and go, yeah, whatever happened to those things? What happened to those recommendations?
Right.
just disappear. We'll just create another committee next year. So we have to make sure this is real. I think there has to be a legitimate commitment from the legislature to say that we have to address the wait list. We have this much money. We have to put money toward it. And it's a lot of money. When I talk about the wait list and those people coming off the behavioral health system, it could be $1.5 billion. But you also have to remember, everything we say is cut in half because you get a 50% federal match. So we have to do that. I think and with additional funding, there has to be a good workforce solution. And most of our agencies, if they're lucky, maybe they can get $15, $16 an hour to their direct support professional workforce. And we all know the stories of warehouses, fast foods, so they're paying $20 an hour. A lot easier work, no overtime. And, and that's what's happening every day. As one CEO told me, that based on our mission and what we do, I feel I can make up $1 to an hour, because people want this, because I can't make up $4 or $5 an hour. Person has to leave.
No.
So there has to also be a realistic, what I call rate setting process. How are the rates developed ongoing into the future? How are we looking at things like the administrative overhead, the infrastructure needs, the QI oversight, the supervision, benefits for employees, all the things that typical businesses do, somehow they feel like agencies can just somehow manage. Invariably, there's proposals out there saying, well, we'll cap how much administration. That's fine, but that's not going to really solve the problem, because you don't even know what the administrative needs are to run an agency like this. And to put into place, like I mentioned, inflation, healthcare costs, things like that, and how it's risen. You can't expect the world to be getting more dollars out to businesses, except those that work with intellectual and developmental disabilities. And then finally, it's taking a close look at all these things that we talked about that are impacting things. Like, let's step back. What are we proposing to CMS when it comes to the HCBS and setting rules and so forth? And have any of them had unintended consequences? And should we look at this again? And sometimes you'll hear from state officials, wow, that'd be terrible. We have to go back to CMS. Right, you go back to CMS. I mean, it's okay. It can be done. And look at other parts of the system, like the SIS. And there's supposedly a new SIS coming out. I don't know, maybe that'll cure the world. I want to see it first before I understand.
Maybe it'll only take 2.5 hours.
That's right. And as you know from my talk, I didn't even get into some of the even crazier questions on the SIS, but I've been talking about this for years, and yet it still continues to grow. And when you go to some of these national conferences, everyone agrees. That's the other thing. It's not like, well, that's your opinion, but these are the great things about it. I don't see it, and see that at all. And make sure that all of our decision processes and funding and rules and regs also have some rationality in that you're not leaving any population behind. So a lot of the things that are proposed in Pennsylvania nationally, I get it. And, maybe it could work for that group. Why does it have to work for everyone? As we, complains is it's a one size fits all. So we have to make sure, okay, that's great for this subset, but for this subset, we may need to fund some different kind of programs and things like that. And it's not that I don't want my son or anyone to get the highest level of functioning, highest level of community interaction, and so forth. I'm not trying to hold anyone back, which advocates also say, well, these parents are holding their children back, which is a really dangerous thing to say to parents who've been living with this. So I want the best and the highest and all, but I also am realistic. So when a few years ago, an advocate was asked, what should the system look like in, I forget, it was 5 years, 10 years, and said, every group home should be closed, every state center should be closed, everyone should be in competitive integrated employment. She went right down the list. I'm thinking, how's that possible? I mean, how could we even say that? And not think about the population then that just will get no services. And I do talk to a lot of providers and say, so based on the funding and all that, you did close that program down. So are all these people like in the community now and getting employment, or what happened? And the answer invariably is, oh no, most of them are just home, but we couldn't support them anymore with the rates and things like that. So and that's a very difficult thing to hear. And even when it comes to employment, I'm on something called the Employment First Commission. And it's because I really do want to support competitive integrated employment. That's a wonderful thing, and we should be pushing it. All I ever say is it is not even fathomable to say, and 100% of the autism and IDD population should be getting that.
Not remotely fathomable. I mean, I have 2 children with nonverbal, severe autism, and it's unthinkable that they could work even 5 minutes in competitive integrated employment. They're their cognitive, dysfunction is so profound. And my son has severe behaviors. There's not a single employer anywhere who would hire him in the entire universe. So there's so much fantasy out there. What about the role for federal government? Like what could we do at the federal level to, I'm going to use Mary's term, open the floodgates to just, reduce, at least lower the barriers to access. I know you work mostly on a state level, but if you were to change like one or two things at the national level, what would it be?
Well, it's interesting. I just got back from 3 days in DC, meeting with legislators and their staff and so forth around some of these things. You're right, though. Probably 95% of everything we talked about are state driven. So that it's their rules, their interpretations, their regs, their funding, and all that kind of thing. I think the couple of things can be done. One is a proposal that's actually out there now from Senator Casey from Pennsylvania to continue increased funding that was in place during COVID to continue for another couple of years or a year. I forget exactly the time frame. That needs it. There could be an influx of dollars to the state that would go out to these agencies. That would be helpful. The second thing is more prescriptive in a positive way. Though you always worry when you ask government for something prescriptive, but CMS really can be overseeing these programs and not just the way it works now is the state proposes things, questions go back and forth, and it gets approved with whatever. And then that's really what CMS does. So if you ask CMS, are these programs working? Are these programs helping as many people as they should? Should there be some oversight or review? They go, we review the submission of waivers. Well, that's good, but what about ongoing? Getting CMS involved in and talking to people like me and others about, so we approved that a year ago. How's it going? How did that program work? Instead, it's just a series of every few years submissions, approvals, more submissions. It's almost more of a paperwork rather than being involved in the quality of the program and is it serving everyone in need. So I think that's important. The final thing I mentioned just off the top of my head, which is another controversial issue that we could spend an hour on, is the whole 14C. And if you know about that, that is a federal rule that allows you, if you don't just pay people sub-minimum wage, but it's in certain situations, if you monitor the productivity of an individual and track it, you're allowed to pay commensurate wages rather than a minimum wage. Very controversial because, you go to a lawmaker and say, we believe there should be sheltered workshops and paid less than minimum wage. It sounds like you're crazy, but you have to look at it a different way. Years ago, my son was taken out to a placement with 2 staff. I asked them, first of all, was he safe? What other people say? Did he seem happy? Did he seem to like it? I mean, do you think he'd want to go back? I asked 1,000 questions. Whether he got paid $4, $5, or $10 an hour, why would that be my issue? That's not the thing. I want to know, but I do know if you immediately say, we eliminate that, all right, the program's closed, and those people, again, are back on a couch doing nothing. So I think when I talk about rational thought, that's another one where people get emotional about it rather than, well, let's analyze this objectively. And are there certain places where it makes some sense, places where it doesn't make sense? But it is, I'll admit, people don't even like to talk about that either.
Well, it's characterized as exploiting, cheap labor, but that's not at all. Maybe that has happened in places at times. I'm not going to deny there are some bad apples here and there, but what it is a service. It's a service to that person that gives them productive, engaged, opportunities in the community. That the 14C programs I know of, come with a whole raft of kind of benefits for the individuals who are working there, right? They would never get in a competitive integrated setting. So it boggles my mind that people are thinking about it as like low wage exploitation when nothing could be further from the truth. It's a positive service for these individuals.
And I mentioned the word continuum of services, which I'm not supposed to say, but the agencies I represent, or RCPA represents, have a continuum. They do provide some of those services, but they also provide competitive wages for some people. They also do community placements and job coaching. And they also, so it goes like that. It's not like we're going to do this for everyone and that's the way it is. That's just not the case.
Right. Nobody should be in 14C who shouldn't be in 14C, right? Obviously, if they can get a job coach and I have, many, many friends with autism here in the Bay Area, all functional levels. And I have several friends who are, who have, I wouldn't say quite full-time jobs, but decent part-time jobs in the community. And, they can do quite well, but they're a different echelon of autism, than my own children. And more power to them. I'm very happy for them. But it's a different world, many different worlds of autism and IDD. Richard, I've taken up so much of your time. This has been super informative. I know the listeners are just going to love hearing you and all of your insights and about all of your work. I hope we have you back. I don't know, maybe next year we can catch up. It's just so really refreshing to talk to somebody who understands the system so well and sees what needs to be done.
Well, thank you again for having me. Really appreciate getting the word out and having this discussion.
Great. And this should go out hopefully on Monday. So thank you so much. I'm going to hit